everybody, and thank you so much, Andy and Lonnie. And I was very surprised when Andy accepted that I would teach this odd Baudelaire text. And I think the reason why perhaps he said yes is because I told him an anecdote, which is that the first time I taught it to a class of Clemente students, and Clemente students are students who are not conversant, or many of them are not conversant with the canon, with great books. And I decided to teach this because not only is it short, but it has some kind of, it's got an urgency that I thought I would test on my students. And if you've read the text, and we'll talk about it, so it's okay if you haven't read it, there is a moment where the narrator is telling us about a friend of his who basically wanted to experience things in a kind of frantic, hysteric way, and tries to set fire in a forest, and tries, and finally, after the 10th time, he succeeds all too well, and the forest starts burning. So I'm looking down at smoke rising from the classroom with a sentiment of horror. And I realized that one of my students, one of a very young, very smart Clemente student, who then went to Bard College and did fantastically, she had taken a match and put herself, or at least her jeans, on fire. And this, of course, horrified me. I decided I should never teach this text again. But then I thought again about it, and of course, I did teach it again. And when I teach it, I tell this story. And I think what's really important about this text is that it appeals to young students. And, I know that many of you are teaching first-year students and students from the humanities who may not continue to become literature students. But this is a wonderful text because it introduces us to so many questions. First of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I've taught this throughout the years and how I'm teaching it differently now, because it's odd, but the needs of my students, the appeal of this text 20 years ago have really changed. Not so much for me, but I've noticed that when I first taught the text, I was myself obsessed with art for art's sake, and art is the only way I could tolerate the terrifyingly anxious, ridden quality of life. And so for me, this text was a perfect example of art as an escape. And so I will talk about this when we look at the text closely. It's an escape because it's also a text about maybe the quality of desire, the quality of when we act for reasons we don't ourselves understand. And this is something that's so exciting about literature. Only in literature maybe can we get this sense that characters act in a way that is forbidden in real life, but also it's a understanding of evil for its own sake. And that, when I was a young teacher, and I was obsessed with Saint Augustine in those days, and I found that this text was so resonant with, for instance, when Saint Augustine, when he's still young, when he's experiencing the free will, he steals the pears from the pear tree, and he says, it was not because I wanted to eat them, it was just to see if I could. And this idea of doing something just for the heck of it, for just to see if you can, was really central in a way to my students, at least 10 years ago, even 15 years ago. they loved this Baudelaire text. They also loved it because I always teach it with Poe. I teach it with the story The Imp of the Perverse, and they were fascinated by this idea of doing something because we don't know why. We need to do it. There's a motivation that goes beyond the rational. And so for a long time, I love the fact that, oh, Baudelaire represents everything I look for in a work of art. I look for something that doesn't resemble real life. I want to understand the idea of freedom and literature. And so as this student, this Clemente student who is transfixed literally by this book and decided that, well, maybe literature and life are the same things, of course not. But another reason I love teaching this text was because at the time, I wasn't only a fanatic of Saint Augustine, but I was also fanatically in love with Dostoevsky. And Notes from Underground was another of the texts that I love teaching with the Bad Glazier. Why? Because in Notes from Underground, the underground man references the Crystal Palace. He references people who believe that rationality is going to actually provide happiness. So he brings up the idea, and this is a reference to the London exhibition when Paxton made this, it was 1851, the Crystal Palace, which was supposed to translate the idea of progress, of we could, with reason, with progress, we can basically fend off all the terrible things that humans have experienced. So with progress, we will no longer be hungry, we will be sated in many ways. And Dostoevsky hated that idea, and the underground man, his fantasy in a way is to basically crush the Crystal Palace. And in the Baudelaire poem, we also have this idea, or at least the word Crystal Palace comes up and is shattered. So this is just to give you a little bit of a background on why I thought this work is so fantastic in a context, not just of comparative literature, but texts that appeal to students who are ripe for existential angst. And you know, we were also reading the sufferings of young Werther. So, you know, how young people, or at least I was that way when I was young, I was always courting texts that brought up suffering and anxiety, and how freedom could never be taken away from me, and nobody could fix that kind of existential wondering that nourished my relationship to literature. But then when I taught it again a few years ago, the students were a little bit moralistic. You won't be surprised about that. And they just said, how can you teach a text with this sadistic guy who's basically berating this poor glazier who's wearing his hard-earned work on his shoulders, and he brings him up to the sixth floor, and then he says, what? You're selling these stupid glazed white transparent panels when what we want is to see life in pink, life in color. And so I'm going to talk about this in a bit, but I realized the students were absolutely shocked by the idea that I could teach a text where the protagonist, the kind of hero, poet, the spokesperson for Baudelaire, was actually a sadist, an evil guy who is basically destroying the poor person that he calls up from the street. So at that point, I said, well, I still don't want to give up on this text. But then I started teaching it with one of the texts that I love and that I try to integrate in almost all of my classes, because I'm so aware that my students are so anxious for me to give them a kind of moral to what we're reading. And I hate books that have a clear sense of morality. So I teach this work and many others with Zadie Smith's wonderful essay on the imagination. And in this essay, she says, when I write, I am so many things. I am a man, I'm a woman, I'm gay, I'm straight, I'm white, I'm black, I'm et cetera, et cetera. And it's all about how the persona of the narrator has very little to do with the writer, him or herself, or themselves. And so I like the idea that suddenly my students are taking away from this text, not this idea that there is a culprit or there is a moral, but on the contrary, this text is very, very complicated. And I realized that when I was younger, I taught this text almost as an inspirational text. And now I realize, especially in preparation for the webinar, I started reading it and rereading it and trying to understand something new about it. And so basically, what happens, and I think this is something good to keep in mind, this is a writer, Charles Baudelaire, who suffered not only from syphilis, but he also suffered from scrutiny and from censorship. And the same year as Flaubert's Madame Bovary was censored, that is in 1857, Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, Les Fleurs du Mal, in 1857, was also censored by the same judge, who basically was saying this is intolerable. These are texts that are basically teaching their audience not to care about morality or not to care about beauty. Literature should only be about beauty, especially if it's poetry. And this is something else that's so fascinating about this text. This is neither poetry nor prose. It's prose poetry. And because of that, you really have to think about, what is Baudelaire doing? He's not writing poetry, even though the Flowers of Evil became one of the most celebrated and is still one of the most celebrated texts. But he basically was hiding in this prose poem maybe a secret agenda. I'm not sure. I'm testing this on all of you, and I want you to test this on your students as well. Because actually, who is the hero of this poem? And so for ages, I imagine that it was, Baudelaire's alter ego, the dandy, the kind of Holden Caulfield / Raskolnikov in his garret, looking down at the world and the world's ugliness, and deciding to take revenge on this ugliness by destroying it, by destroying the livelihood of this man. But actually, maybe the hero, the poet, might be the glazier himself. And why? Because the glazier is basically the one who is being destroyed. He's being destroyed, he's being misunderstood, just like the poet. And I want you to think of the poet the way you might want to think about a contemporary, first successful painter, all right, who's showing in Chelsea, great success at the Gagosian Gallery, and then suddenly nothing. This great painter, people lose interest in them and go on to something else. So basically, possibly that hidden in this poem, I was going to say this painting, in this poem, is this idea that both the narrator and the poor glazier, and it's weird that the poem is called The Bad Glazier. Why is that something you should ask the students? Why is he a bad glazier? Is he bad because he doesn't have colorful paints? He doesn't allow the dandy poet to see the world transformed? Or is he bad because he represents basically the society's view that is condemning him for not turning poetry only into something beautiful? And this is really fascinating because in France in the 19th century, and I can imagine it was the same in many canonical relationships to poetry, poetry for a long time was not supposed to talk about ugliness. It wasn't supposed to talk about sex. It wasn't supposed to talk about anything that wasn't uplifting. So poetry was really poetry in its own right was being incredibly moralistic in the sense that you read poetry to become not only a better reader, that is, a reader who recognized in poetry the canon and what had come before, and poetry was not supposed to remind you that you were weak and that you were vulgar and that you had a job that you didn't like. So basically, this is a prose poem that is telling you, why can't poetry be whatever I want it to be? And so when you look at it this way, when the evil narrator brings the poor glazier or the bad glazier up to the sixth floor, he is basically acting a little bit like the censors who are saying, we don't want this kind of reality. We want a reality that we ourselves have prescribed. So this is really a surprise. It was such a surprise to me to start rethinking how I've been teaching this all along. That doesn't mean that I won't continue to talk about art for art's sake, because with Baudelaire, there's always two sides to everything. Baudelaire, in so many ways, is a moralist. There's something religious about him. There's something transcendental about him. But he's also an anti-moralist. He detests a kind of didacticism that was just rife in that culture. And so that too is interesting to teach for our students, because our students, understandably, they're seeking desperately an answer. Oh, I'm taking a lit class and now I'm going to go and understand what's happening in politics. They can't do that with great literature. You can. I mean, if it's great, sorry to seem so old-fashioned, but to me, great literature always has a double agenda or no agenda or a multiple agenda. I mean, Virginia Woolf, it teaches us to see with thousands of eyes. So let's just look for a minute, and I'm gonna share the screen. Let me make sure that yeah, just a few more things before we look at the text itself. But it was interesting that both Flaubert, Madame Bovary's author, and Baudelaire were not particularly friends. In fact, Baudelaire hated Madame Bovary, was very, very mad at Flaubert, because he said, how dare you critique this poor woman who was so misunderstood? She is someone who loved poetry, and you turn her into a vulgar reader of bad fiction. But then when Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil was censored, Flaubert wrote him a lovely letter and said, "This is terrible. I can't believe that poetry now is being censored. This is the first time that we are actually seeing France in such a bad way that it even is now censoring its poets." So I thought that was interesting. It's in a way, the censorship brought those two huge figures together. So let me just share the screen for a second, and let's look together at the text. So here we go. I'm going to share it. And what I did, just to put you a little bit off kilter or something, is that the translation that you read, that is in the link, is by Keith Waldrop. He's a wonderful translator, wonderful poet. But I decided also to switch things around a little bit and use Stu Watson's translation as well, because it's a little bit more fluid and a little bit more irreverent. And that's from the six prose poems by Baudelaire. But I just wanted to start just with I've started hours ago, it seems, but I just wanted to remind you, and this is something great to put for the students when you're doing this poem, is pose an excerpt from the story The Imp of the Perverse. We stand upon the brink of a precipice, we peer into the abyss, we grow sick and dizzy. Our first impulse is to shrink away from danger, etc., etc. It is merely the idea of what would be our sensations during the sweeping precipitancy of a fall from such a height. For this very cause do we now the most vividly desire it. So, the Baudelaire prose poem starts with this. It's like, oh, we know there are certain natures, they're contemplative, we don't understand why they act, they do absurd and dangerous stuff. So this is the story about the setting on fire. One of my friends, an inoffensive dreamer, set fire to a forest, he explained, in order to see if the flames would really spread as quickly as people said. 10 times in a row, his efforts knew defeat. The 11th time, he achieved victory all too well. So he explains a little bit at the beginning of the prose poem, and it's kind of odd. It doesn't really work. Is this a poem, or is this a little lecture about how doctors and philosophers get human nature wrong? So you can talk about that to your students and ask them to wonder why the kind of the texture of the poem changes. First, you have this kind of pedantic kind of beginning, and then you have something else. So what really happens when everything starts is when this narrator opens his window, alas. All right. So it's all the fault of curiosity. Another reference in a way, maybe to Saint Augustine, oh, curiosity killed the cat, in other words. So you open the window, and what happens? First of all, imagine a window. The window is our windows to the soul, this whole cliche of windows, the inside and the outside. But what happens is he opens a window and he sees a glazier, a glass cellar, the sharp discordance of his cries drifting up to me through the stale and heavy Parisian smog. Now, this is no Michelin guide to beautiful Paris. It's just the poet is looking down and feels utter contempt for the ugliness outside. And so here again, you're thinking, oh, yes, it's the poet. What he really wants is art. He doesn't want all this ugly crudeness. And so he's suddenly, and this is where my students get so mad at me for assigning this poem, he feels a sudden and tyrannical hatred for this poor man. You can hear the students, how can you assign this poor man, this tyrannical hatred? What even is a tyrannical hatred? Even that, you ask them, what is all this about? So he calls this poor Bad Glazier, and he calls him up, and look at the sadism here. Not without pleasure did I reflect that my room was on the 6th floor, and he would climb those flights with difficulty. Oh my God, the guy is really pushing it here, lest his fragile goods be damaged. So he appears, and again, this question of curiosity. Is it real curiosity? Is it fake curiosity? He's examining all his pains. He's taking his time. And as you know, all the time he's taking is time taken away from the glazier, who could be selling his wares to the rest of the Parisians. And then he explodes. What? You have no colored glass, no pinks, no reds, no blues, no magical paints, no pains of the gods. Impudent creature, you sell your wares to the poor, and yet you have no pains that are able to make life beautiful. Okay, so this was, of course, my way of teaching the class. Is like, of course, what we really want from literature is transformation. We don't want realism. We don't want what naturalism was promising, how literature is basically mimetic. Literature is an imitation of life. And, at that point, the students are getting interested again. Shouldn't literature be like life? Shouldn't literature help us maybe imitate life, so we can in turn use that to live in a better way? So we use this idea of anti-mimetic prose to talk about these questions. Also, I ask my students, well, when you go to a museum, what do you want? What happens if you see a work of art that seems to be duplicating your reality? Don't you also want to escape? Don't you also want not to understand something in a work of art? What about abstraction? So is the pinks, the reds, the blues, is this a matter of defending a kind of literature that is going to give us exactly what we don't have, fantasy? And that goes back to what Dostoevsky was talking about in Notes from Underground. Do we really want the Crystal Palace to reflect a perfect life? Why would we want a perfect life? We want imperfection on some level. So the evil narrator pushes him, the poor guy groaning and stumbling, out to the stairs. And then happens the unbelievable explosion. As if he hadn't done enough damage, our friend here, or our enemy, went out to my balcony and grabbed a small flower pot. And this is so Baudelaire for you. It's a flower pot. Flower and pot. There's basically the two sides of flower. That's what the censors thought they wanted from literature. They wanted flowers, the florid, the beautiful. But he takes this little stupid flower pot, which he calls my engine of war, which has to be ironic. I mean, who uses as their engine of war a little flower pot, probably filled with little ugly half-dead geraniums? And he takes it and he throws it. He lets his engine of war fall right on the back of his pack, the reverberations from the impact sending him reeling. Falling on his back, he managed to break all of his poor portable merchandise with a crash akin to lightning striking a crystal palace. Here we go, the Crystal Palace. Just like in Notes from Underground, Baudelaire is basically using this image of something that was construed as something positive, the Crystal Palace, but destroys it. But again, now that our reading has become complicated and I'm still not sure what to make of it, is he basically destroying the critic? Who is this evil guy, idle and bored and wanting to basically destroy this poor guy who's done nothing wrong? Or is the poor Glazier, Baudelaire, or the poet himself or themselves, who basically is going to be misunderstood, is going to be trampled upon? And so, intoxicated by madness, I scream furiously, make life beautiful, make life beautiful. Through such capricious endeavors are not without peril, and one must often pay dearly for them. And now this is complicated, and I don't know how we can do this in English for our students, but it is in English it is, what does an eternity of damnation compare with an infinity of pleasure in a single second? The French word is jouissance, and even ChatGPT had no answer for me. I actually asked ChatGPT to translate jouissance to me. They had no idea, which gave me infinite pleasure. But jouissance is a kind of pleasure, and it's something orgasmic. But ChatGPT is very prudish and refused to put that word in its little explanation. So this is how the poem ends, and it is basically leaving us with this question: is this a poem about art for art's sake? Is this a poem about censorship? Is this a poem about the double nature of all works of art? How do we know what a work of art is trying to do? Is this basically telling us, encouraging us to be like the narrator and not look for art as though we're looking into our mirror or looking out of the window? Is art supposed to be a transformation, something that is not like us, something basically that will turn our boring, idle lives into something beautiful? Or basically, is this a critique of anyone who is treating art in a prescriptive way? Why should art be one thing or another? And the narrator basically wants art to be one thing. He wants art to be pink and blue and colorful and not mimetic. He does not want his own reality to be reflected in a work of art. So I'm very eager to teach this class again now that I've done all this new rethinking because of this webinar. Thank you, Andy, for this. Thank you, Lonnie, for this. And now, if you want, we can open this to questions, or you can maybe look out of the window and wonder whether you prefer, pink, blue, or just a boring, transparent window pane. So thank you for listening.
Marina, I really don't know quite what to say. This was such a masterful class in showing how a close reading of a text can move outward into the world from which it emerged, and also what a direct and powerfully personal impact it can have on the reader, in this case, the teacher, and the students in the room. I'm sure there are questions, and maybe to give folks a moment to formulate them and write them down. I'll start with a probably not quite articulate question. You said that you've been interested in the way in which your students have changed in their relation to the poem. And I took you to mean that you have had in the past, and maybe it's not a chronological thing, but you've had some students who seemed implicitly to identify with the narrator of this poem, to feel that the experience of anger and an outburst of pure freedom without any moral judgment was something that they experienced themselves. And then you said that other students had a moralistic reaction to it and felt the requirement here was to judge the narrator and to condemn his action, which is pretty condemnable by any normal standard of morality. I guess my question is, how do you negotiate a work like this, and this is not the only one, obviously, but a work like this that can raise such fundamental questions about our relationship to other people and our sense of responsibility and being in the world. How do you move between a sort of intellectual, literary, historical take on the work and the personal questions that are probably on the minds of the students? Like, do you know people like this who might act out an act of violence at any moment and do something that they will regret for the rest of their lives? Are you such a person? Do you feel this way? So it feels to me that those kind of issues are near the surface with a work like this. And I just wonder if you might be willing to say a little bit more about how you conduct a discussion of a work like this in a room with, 12, 15, 20 young people who are having powerful reactions to it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, as you were speaking, so many memories of classes came back to me. One time I was teaching this, it was actually close to 9/11, and you might remember that terrible statement by the composer Stockhausen, I think it was, who basically praised the planes crashing into the buildings as a perfect work of art. And so we spoke about that with total horror. But then the students, and this is where it's interesting, when you think your students want something, and then they themselves go into this kind of weird dialectic mode, and they talk about their own boredom. So the question of boredom surfaces often when I teach this text, because many of them say, we experience boredom, although alas, they experience it less and less. And now, I mean, recently one of my students said, I wish we could throw out all our telephones because we don't have enough boredom in our life anymore. But to go back to your question is, there's a double kind of reaction going on. One, which is, we understand the quest for sensations. We understand that when we feel anxious, when we feel bored, we want to do crazy things. You ask me, do I relate? Yes, you know how I relate? I love speeding. I have to say, and I have been stopped. It's horrible. I mean, I love speeding. And I remember the first time in my life that I experienced this, I was behind someone who was driving a very fast motorcycle, and it was so dangerous, and it was so exhilarating, because the relationship between danger and exhilaration is something that I can't explain it. But I remember when I dismounted this engine of war, we could say, I felt, oh, everything else is not worth it. Nothing is interesting after this incredible moment. And what's happening, and I think this is happening in the poem, is that there are moments where we need to escape from the kind of prosaic nature of life. But the problem is that prosaic nature of life is life. And if we don't basically address it, if we only identify with the dandy narrator, we are going to be doomed, because life can't happen that way. Thank goodness it can't happen that way. It's the glazier, in fact, who is maybe transporting these pains that are not so fantastically inspiring or transformative, learning to see life not through the pink or the blue or the green pains, but through regular pains, is the difficulty of living. But it's also the difficulty and the pleasure of close reading. Close reading is not a bingo, this is what this is about. It's the slow scrutiny of word after word. And so it's funny how your question is also really about reading.
I'll say one more thing, because we seem to have a shy group on our hands today. I hope others will chime in, but I maybe your discussion has put me in a slightly reckless mood, so I shouldn't probably say this, but I will. Listening to what you were just saying about Poe calls it the imp of the perverse, your attraction to the speeding motorcycle, the transgressive breaking of the norms. There may be something in that helps to answer a question that's on a lot of people's minds, especially academic intellectuals, and that is what is the nature of the appeal of one of the presidential candidates? Why, with all the boundary breaking that we've come to expect from him, are so many people attracted? Now, no doubt there are lots of different answers to that question, and as I say, I probably shouldn't go down this road, but I wonder whether what you're talking about has something to do with it, that an appetite for something beyond the normal and the excitement of it, without thinking very hard about what the consequences might be if you indulge in that kind of excitement. So anyway, that came to mind listening to you, so I put it out there, and people should.
Well, I mean, I had no idea that this this would come up today. This is why literature is so great. You see, it brings everything back to our reality, to a reality that doesn't exist. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is such an appeal in risk and danger and the hell with it all. There's an expression in French, it's après moi le déluge, after me, let everything go to seed, who cares? But also I think the appeal of tyranny, because tyranny is something that divests us of personal responsibility. And boredom is personal responsibility. Looking at a window pane that is not pink, green, or red is personal responsibility. To see the world transformed and almost giving the world an intoxicant, it's almost like the poet wants to be intoxicated, and because he doesn't want to have to cope with this inner kind of unease. And Baudelaire was a great reader of the moralists. He was a great reader of Augustine, of Pascal, and Pascal, one of the famous and very quoted during COVID lines from Pascal is, basically, the most terrifying thing for a human is to be alone in a room doing nothing. And in a way, that's what the narrator of Baudelaire is doing. He's in a room alone doing nothing, and it is such it's so anxious inducing that he has to do anything to get away from this nothingness.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. We have a question, Lonnie, or a couple of questions. Lonnie, will you be the moderator of the questions?
Sure, yeah, we are starting to get those questions. But if I may sort of maybe abuse my power as a as someone on the Zoom screen, I was just wondering, Marina, about you've been talking about close reading, and I was just thinking about close reading about works in translation and sort of the double layers that are inherent when you're reading a work in translation, what that experience is like for you and for your students. When you're teaching, for example, this particular text to English speakers, do you show them multiple translations? Do you select a passage and show different translations of that same piece of text? And how you just talk to students about there's a layer of meaning being applied just by the act of translation, the choices that the translator is making.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So what I did today, which I presented the text in a different translation, was to give you a feeling that you're reading basically an interpretation. So what you're doing as a reader, you are interpreting, but reading a translation, you're doubly, triply interpreting. And I'll give you a quick example, which is very, very strange. So I've been asked to translate into French a book that I wrote in English. And it's very, very strange because you realize that translating is really rewriting. You're having a very different experience. You have to bring yourself in there. And on some level, we wish we didn't. We wish that we could just keep Baudelaire as is, but then that's ridiculous. Every reader is always basically bringing in the wealth of their experience into the text. So translating is just it's exacerbating something that's in every experience of reading. But of course, it's better to read it in French, but I think it works wonderfully in translation as well. Thank you, Lonnie.
Thank you. So, Marina, one question from our audience is about, you had made a comment earlier in your talk about how you find students can have a moralistic response sometimes to literature. Do you find that they can have such a response to the visual arts? Are there ways in which you juxtapose literature with visual art? And so could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And I talked a little bit about censorship in my reading of this poem, where it occurred to me after reading it many times to realize that this is a prose poem that could be actually attacking all form of censorship. And I have been really saddened, and apologies for bringing in my own state of mind here, to see how certain students really have no more interest in works that basically and I'm just saying some students. The majority of students are still as delighted by Vermeer and you name it, but I do feel that there is I find it a curious need or a curious kind of tendency to want something that can be immediately identified as even weaponized. And I just feel that the great thing about interpretation, whether it's literature, whether it's art, whether it's music, and music is a great example. Music is much harder to appropriate, to moralize, and than literature and art. But why should it be? And again, going back to Zadie Smith, I so love that text on the imagination, because she really says that the person who is creating is actually, and this brings us back to the idea of the daimon, Daimon. The person who is creating is not the person you and I know. It's when you're writing, when you're painting, when you're composing, you go into this strange state that the ancients believed was a way of mediating the gods and the humans. And so the creator is there doing something kind of mysterious to themselves as well. So yeah, I think unfortunately people are turning away from problems because they will read them too fast. They will read them as problems instead of reading them as multiplicities.
I was thinking about what you're saying about boredom and how in visual, this is something I've experienced with paintings, for example. If I don't know very much about a painting or an artist or what the artist is trying to do, because I don't know what to look for, sometimes I can just sort of gloss over, I just kind of pass by. Right? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to articulate is that sometimes the more you know about something, the more you know to look, and therefore you just notice more, and that just helps you appreciate what's in front of you in a different way.
Yeah,
And something
sorry.
here to close reading, when you're reading something closely and really thinking carefully about why the author made choices to string words in a particular way, you understand what the person, you sort of get a sense of what the author intended for the effect that the author was intending to have on you as a reader. And that adds to your appreciation for the text. And so I was just thinking, sometimes the act of you're bored because you just don't know enough.
Right.
You're not noticing. And so how do you get to notice?
Yeah.
If I put in on this second, I mean, I think what Lonnie says is absolutely right, absolutely true. But for the challenge for teaching, and I think we're really face to face with it in this session, is that on the one hand, it certainly helps and to know, for instance, about the Baudelaire correspondence with Flaubert that you mentioned, or about the significance of the Crystal Palace and the meaning that had in the middle of the 19th century. That's very valuable, and that's a context that can be built in a kind of lecture format or an explanation for first 20 or 30 minutes of the class, perhaps. But at the same time, this is a text that comes from a strange place that most of our students don't know anything about, and yet it's so direct and so it has such a forceful impact that you can have a useful discussion of this text if you don't know anything about it.
Absolutely.
And that's, there's another question in the Q&A about whether you think longer works, such as novels, are susceptible to this kind of approach. And I don't want to answer for you, but I think they do present a different kind of challenge that a short work like this or a short story can be perhaps most effective, particularly maybe in the early weeks of a course, where you get the students used to talking about their reactions to a work of literature and not intimidated by a long novel with a lot of characters and a lot of different things going on. So I just wanted to say that. But
Yeah, yes, and I would say, and maybe it's not such a bad thing, but I remember I used to assign much longer books, and there was a trend which was that it's outrageous to assign selections of books. I really think that was a kind of weirdly elitist idea because I think that close reading of short passages will encourage students then to read more. I mean, it's I don't know. I mean, I really believe that you need to get people into the texture of literature, and it's too easy to then go and look at Wikipedia and look for summaries, and that's not interesting. I mean, a little text like this, and all of Baudelaire's prose poems are amazing. I love teaching them. And again, I teach them with Kafka and with Poe. So I teach the hunger artist with this other Baudelaire prose poem called the old acrobat, which is an amazing little poem about how the artist is forgotten, and how art is so dependent on the whims of a public who is bored and keeps wanting new distractions. Amazing to teach this in 2024, really.
I love that you said that. I know we're pushing against 1:30, but I just like have to react to that. There's a lot of lamentation going on right now. There was recently a whole article about it in the Atlantic magazine, a lamentation about how the students can't read whole books anymore, or by implication, long books anymore. And yeah, sure, there's reason to be concerned about that, and there's time and place for reading long books. But there's some advantages, as you just suggested, in focusing more tightly on shorter works, maybe even excerpts, because it's a way to inculcate the habit of close reading that you have demonstrated for us today. I couldn't agree with that more. And I think it's really important to put that out there.